So while I got you, I thought, why don't I just share some of my favorite arcade memories from across the years? Obviously, since I said I look back so fondly on the early 90s, what was it about the early 90s other than the games themselves? How did I play them? What did we do? That sort of thing. Well, I think the first arcade I ever went to in my life was probably arcade in the mall, because, again, malls would have arcades at the time, and this was an arcade, I believe it was called Time's Up. And the way that it worked is that you went in there and basically they had a whole bunch of games. You could basically play Mortal Kombat, you could play Street Fighter 2, you could play Simpsons, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They had a whole bunch of great, modern games that you could play there. And obviously, in order to play, you had to have tokens. So you would just simply get some of your folks to give you like a 10 or a 20 or something, or you would spend a little bit of money you got at your birthday, and you would basically exchange for tokens until you basically ran out of tokens. And that was so much fun. That was basically the first taste of arcade I ever had. And it kind of would go a little ballooned from there. A couple of other noteworthy places that I can think of when it came to arcades was Las Vegas. A lot of people don't remember this because Las Vegas has kind of backed down from this image. But around the time of the turn of the 90s, and specifically around the time of the early 2000s, Las Vegas was trying to remarket itself as a family-friendly place. I think that's kind of been lost ever since, and I think it's basically now it's mostly for drinking and gambling and stuff. But at the time, they were kind of trying to bring in families, and so obviously the parents would gamble, and they distract the kids by opening up like theme parks or themed attractions, or in this case, arcades or themed restaurants. And I remembered the hotel that my folks stayed at, which was the MGM Grand Casino, had an enormous arcade. An arcade that you could pretty much spend half the day there on just 25 bucks. Seriously. The arcade had not just all the machines I was just telling you about, they also had an Area 51 machine, which was phenomenally awesome. That was probably one of my favorite light gun shooters of all time, and still one of my favorite light gun shooters of all time. That was just a great game. But also they had simulators, which was the first time I had ever seen or interacted with essentially what was essentially VR arcade simulation, arcade simulator systems. And the way they worked was that I think it was a Sega, it was some kind of Sega flight simulator system. And the way it worked was that you'd be strapped into this cockpit, and you were behind the throttle of an F-16 or equivalent airplane, and you were essentially dropped in the middle of a dogfight. And you could go upside down. Basically, however you turned, that was how you basically played. And I remember distinctly playing most of my game upside down, because as far as I was concerned, if I set my enemies in my sights, I don't care if I'm up or if I'm down, but I'm going to be shooting at them until they're gone. And true story, the first time I played, I think I brought down 8 targets and I couldn't land because the ending was you landed an aircraft carrier. But the second time I played, I got 20 and I was able to land. So I picked up on that game pretty well, or maybe it was just, more gaming experience did the trick. But that was a separate charge, kind of like how those VR simulators are over at the Dave & Buster's now, but we'll get into that later. Another one that I remember specifically was, I think people were talking about a place called GameWorks. That was a more later thing. I think that was about late 90s, probably around 98 or 2000 or so. And the thing about GameWorks was that they also had basically a pretty good selection of arcade games, including a really good arcade of The Lost World. There was a fantastic cabinet for The Lost World Jurassic Park that was available at that time. It was a great system. It was a great game. But the thing about GameWorks is that they intentionally just made themselves more expensive. So you could pay essentially twice the amount of credits at a GameWorks, and the only thing that set them apart, as far as I was concerned at the time, was that depending upon how much you paid, they would let you use the rock climbing course, or which I thought was kind of a novelty, but again, is pretty standard nowadays. Instead of having tokens, they gave you a swipe card with a magnetic strip on it. That was, as far as I know, GameWorks, I think, was the first company to really do that. And basically, so you would pay for whatever, they'd give you a card, and then you'd basically use that card, and all the games were rigged up not to take tokens, but to take swipes. And obviously, for the novelty, they would charge twice the amount of credits for the same game. So if I was playing a game at the MGM Grand Casino, obviously I'd be paying tokens, but I would pay, let's say, 50 cents on a token, in tokens for a gameplay for the same game at GameWorks would cost $1. I don't know what that tells you. Maybe, like I said, maybe because they were using the swipes, they felt that was, that was more fair. But I kind of thought that was a little bit, I didn't really feel like going back there, to be perfectly honest. Again, it was a big place with a good selection. I did not climb the rock climbing course, although my cousin's ex-husband did. I was told he made it, but yeah, no, this was like I said, it was a cool little theme place. They kind of made it look like a gas works or like a industrial mill or something like that. But I don't know, that didn't really appeal to me at the time. I was more interested in cyberpunk at the time, a cyberpunk aesthetic and VR and stuff like that. I don't even remember GameWorks really having anything like that. And then obviously there was always Chuck E. Cheese. And Chuck E. Cheese was not a place you went for food. That was a place you went to play games. Obviously, the father of Chuck E. Cheese is, of course, also known as the father of Atari, Nolan Bushnell. All props to you, Nolan Bushnell, for creating Chuck E. Cheese. The game that I really remember was the original Jurassic Park. Now, for those of you who don't know about the original Jurassic Park game, was the trick about that game was that you were playing essentially a light gun game that was on rails, but the trick is that you were doing it from a Jeep, or in the universe, you were doing it from a Jeep. And truth be told, that Jeep moved. So if you were going up, you were going up. You were going down, you were going down. It was essentially a Disneyland ride, essentially. No joke. I remember, and again, I'm pretty certain the original Jurassic Park game was also at the MGM Grand Casino's arcade, because I remember playing that game every day, every week. I would just be putting down a stack of quarters and just like playing Jurassic Park over and over again. That game was so much fun. Because, again, the simulator portion of it was a major component. As for other stuff that would come later, obviously, as time went on, arcades were kind of starting to shutter. So obviously, I wasn't going to Chuck E. Cheese anymore. I was getting older at this point. I think even Time Out closed at some point. But, and like I said, I was getting older. So where was I playing video games from? And I was playing video games at the movie theaters. Because while I was getting older, I was still going to see new movies every week with my friends. My parents would drop me off with enough money for a ticket and maybe a soda or something like that. And I would go with my friends to go see a movie that week at the theater. And my local theater, as horrible as I've made it out over the years, would actually have some pretty good arcade machines. They had Area 51. They had another game that I absolutely was gaga for, and that was Cruisin' USA, the driving game across the United States. That game later got released on the N64. And my friend L Train, who we've seen in earlier videos where we talked about the Nintendo 64, had a copy of it. And we played the hell out of that game. Because the one regret we had was that it didn't support the Rumble Pack that came with the Star Fox 64. But everything else about it, we freaking loved that game. We would do everything we could to try to unlock new cars, to try to find, secret cars and stuff like that. Obviously, we found some of the extra cars, but in the other cars, we'd have to earn them, and that was pretty cool. Cruisin' USA was probably one of the last major arcade games that I really was interested in. Again, I kind of felt that was end of the 90s. And then everything basically went away. And the reason why, of course, was because Arcades were starting to shutter because at that point you started having consoles like the PS2, the original Xbox, the GameCube, and of course you had the PC. And while you could have an arcade presentation for a game like Cruis'n USA, which was like a sit-down cabinet, or you could have a flight simulator like that Sega F-16 simulator I was telling you about, and there was no replicating that, really, at least not at home, unless you had some really, really custom, expensive equipment. Replicating a game like Mortal Kombat, or even Cruis'n USA, you know, on a couch, stand-up, was very possible. And while the quality probably wasn't as good, it was good enough to keep you home. And of course, there were perks like, well, you could play with the guy next to you, or you could play online, which you couldn't do at the time at the arcade, certainly. So at that point, probably around at least by 2001, 2002, I basically started, you know, obviously it was like I was all home gaming, and the arcade started taking a hit. However, if you fast forwarded about 10 years, 15 years after that, the arcade once again started getting a resurgence. Certain individual organizations were still around that were making arcade machines. They weren't selling to venues as plentiful as they were previously, but what that meant was that they could make bigger machines. They could make more elaborate machines. Companies like Raw Thrills were making huge simulators, which would handle like four arcade racers next to each other, or 8 arcade racers next to each other. You would have enormous screens, some of them projectors, some of them just big screens in general. And you could present a family or a couple on date night an interesting option. Dinner in a game, or dinner in an arcade. And games afterwards. And good dinner. I mean, it wasn't like Chuck E. Cheese, where as far as I remember, I'm quoting Nolan Bushnell on this, they could never get the pizza to actually be good. But you know, like Dave & Buster's food was perfectly fine as far as I was concerned. And one of my first dates, in fact, the 1-year anniversary of my my wife and I, we were just, you know, it was a 1-year anniversary of us started dating. My wife and I, when we were dating, on our 1-year anniversary of dating, we went to the Dave & Buster's in Times Square. That was the first time I had ever gone there. And it was actually her idea to go. And we had a blast. And I remembered playing games that I had never seen before. And my God, I can't even remember. But of course, obviously, how did Dave & Buster's work? They forgoed the tokens. Everything was on the swipe cards now. So the swipe cards pretty much became standard. Tokens were basically becoming the way of the dodo at this point. But as a positive, you could actually get your ticket prizes if you were earning tickets onto your card. So as you were spending credits or tokens or whatever you want to call them while you were playing games, the tickets that you were earning, the prize tickets that you were earning, were also being applied to the card. So that when you were done playing, you could check your balance, swipe your card, and pick out whatever prizes you wanted from the prize booth. By the time 2018 came around, when I was working in Massachusetts almost full-time, at least for about a good season, basically like 3 or 4 months, I was working full-time in Massachusetts. I was not far from the Dave & Buster's over there, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but there was a Dave & Buster's on the way back to my hotel. And by the time I was done with work, it would be happy hour at Dave & Buster's. And I remembered being able to get a good deal on Dave & Buster's happy hour food, buy a deal on a whole bunch of credits, and essentially have, a good meal and a lot of fun games. I remembered playing Spider-Man. I remembered playing, and that was a fun game that I was really good at. Space Invaders Frenzy, I believe it was called, which I was really good at back when that was a ticket machine. I would hit the jackpot on that like crazy. Now it's no longer offering tickets. But one of the other games that I absolutely had to play a lot was a game called Halo Fireteam Raven. That game is still available to play in Dave & Buster's, and I'm sure that there were probably some other venues that played it. I remember Halo Outpost Discovery had some 2-player cabinets at the time that you could actually play on. But I remember Fireteam Raven being a great game, and I remembered going to Dave & Buster's occasionally and just playing through Fireteam Raven. Out of all of the games I listed, I would love to see a port of Fireteam Raven, but given the fact that it was a dual-screen 4-player light gun machine, that probably is a whiles away before we'll actually see a home cabinet version of that. But that having been said, it was a really fun game, and there was a great Easter egg that they worked in that I always noticed at the very end. The game follows the events of the first Halo. You're just playing it from a fire team of ODSTs as opposed to from the Master Chief's perspective. Obviously, we know how it ends. The first Halo game, the Halo does get destroyed. That's not, I guess that would be a spoiler, but it's really not a spoiler. The Chief does destroy the first Halo. And right above you, there is a lit-up Halo ring, or a portion of a lit-up Halo ring. And if you can make it to the game's ending, and the Halo, you watch the Halo explode in glorious 4K, they shut the light off right above you to indicate that the Halo has been destroyed. And I thought that was a really nice touch. It's a great game. And if you're an Xbox Live player, specifically an Xbox Live player that plays like Halo 5 Guardians religiously, you want to be able to link your arcade experience to your Xbox Live profile, because you're going to want to get some extra exclusive additions to your Halo 5 Guardians character from that. But those are just some of my thoughts about the arcade.